some folks do, so.
Oh, I see. Please come to your seats. Let's get started. All right, please take your seats, and if you're still on your way to your seats, quietly go there. I am calling this 179th session of the Northern Illinois Annual Conference into order. So if this is the 179th session, what's next year?
181.
You people can't count. Of course it's the 180th, so we'll have to make some kind of deal about that. My mother asked me the other day, well, how long has this annual conference been meeting? 15 years, 25 years? I said, 179 years. She said, it's a lot of meeting. So over these years, we have certainly addressed many, many different things. And we have sought to be the church when it was in season and out of season, when we knew where we were going and when we didn't know where we were going. And so this year we come together with our theme of navigating uncharted waters as we face what is presently before us as a denomination, as local churches. And we do it together, and we do it with hope. So this session is called to order, and throughout this, our sessions the next 2 days, our prayers will represent some aspects of our tradition. So one of the things we do celebrate, and we'll hear more about this later, is 50 years of being the United Methodist Church. So we will begin, in my estimation, appropriately, with a former Evangelical United Brethren layperson. How many of you grew up EUB, E or UB, or EUB, or attend a former EUB United Methodist Church? A few of you, all right. 2 out of the 3 churches that I served in East Ohio were former EUBs, so I have a real affinity for them. And we have, as our prayer, Phyllis Tholen, and we're going to see her through modern technology. But that means you still have to be in a spirit of prayer. If you would roll the video.
Please pray with me. Creator God, we stand before you at this 51st opening session of the Northern Illinois Conference of the United Methodist Church. We give thanks for those who worked to bring this church into being 50 years ago. We especially lift up those who prayed and organized and demonstrated to assure that the segregated nature of the central jurisdiction would not be a part of the new church. And we give thanks for those leaders who brought together the congregations and leaders of the Rock River Conference and the Lexington Conference in 1964, and the Rock River Conference of the Methodist Church and the Illinois Conference of the EUB Church in 1968 to form our present annual conference structure. We confess, O God, that we have not created a perfect church. We have not loved you with our whole hearts. We have not loved our neighbors as ourselves. We have too often considered the maintenance of church structure before the message of the gospel. We continue to isolate persons because of their color, their language, their physical and material resources, and their gender identification. We have lived within a church structure that specifically excludes persons who are gay or lesbian, bisexual, or transgendered. Forgive us, we pray. As we go about the work of this conference and as we go back to our congregations and to our places in the community, guide us in our thoughts and in our actions, that we might do justice in the world you have created and with all its people, that we might love kindness as we consider those suffering from famine or flood, war and violence, or personal tragedy, and that we might walk humbly with you in all the aspects of our daily lives. And above all, help us to love all of our neighbors as you love us. Amen.
Amen. We're appreciative of modern technology to be able to have her presence with us. Many of you know her as a longtime lay delegate. Now I'll call on Alka Lyle, Reverend Alka Lyle, who chairs the annual conference committee, and she will help us with our organizing motions.
Good morning, Bishop, guests, colleagues, and members of the Northern Illinois Conference. My name is Alka Lyle, pastor at Broadway United Methodist Church in Chicago and chair of your annual conference committee. And on behalf of the whole committee, I welcome us to the 179th session of the Northern Illinois Conference. Before we organize, I wanted to share just a few things that might be important for us during these next couple days. Every year, your annual conference committee tries to live into the Wesleyan principle of moving on to perfection, to make this a satisfying experience for everyone. And every year, we're successful with some people. But we will continue to try. Our effort always is to make this conference session as accessible as we can possibly make it for all persons. This year, Susan Harkness joins Kathy Wellman and Violet Joniker to make sure accessibility needs are met to the best of our ability. Please reach out to them for any accessibility questions or concerns. They will be available in the office area. We also have sign interpretation available for all our worship services. We have secured a new AV service this year, hoping to provide us with an upgraded audiovisual service. The password for our Wi-Fi has been scrolling on the screen. It will continue to scroll. It's Northern Illinois 2018. N uppercase, spelled Northern, IL for Illinois, and then 2018. When we first announced to you our dates and our planning of the 2018 annual conference, we told you we will be working on a picture directory this year, but due to some unavoidable situations, we were unable to secure a company that would provide us quality service during these couple days. So we will plan on doing it next year. You have already received an email from Laura, especially the clergy, about your new photo IDs, and I think you have already received them also if you requested a new one. The booklets that you received at registration are an important tool for us for these 2 days. You have worship bulletins in them, you have your agenda in them, you have information on our ecumenical guests, our honored guests, and other participants during these 2 days with us. This year, also, along with the regular United Methodist men's prayer line, we have 3 prayer stations in this space. And more information about that is in your booklet on pages 44 and 45. So I invite you to look at those pages and use these prayer booths as best as we can. I just hope that these 2 days will enhance our learning, strengthen our relationships, inspire us to be better disciples of Jesus Christ, and encourage us to further God's kingdom on earth, and particularly in the Northern Illinois Conference. So, time to get us organized, Bishop, so we can begin our work together. Bishop, I move that the agenda printed in the booklet be received we all received at registration be the agenda for this 179th session of the Northern Illinois Conference.
Okay, that's properly before us from the committee. Any questions? Then all those in favor of approving the agenda, please say yes. Yes. And those who wouldn't, say no. And it carries.
Bishop, I move the registration list be the roll call for the 179th session of the Northern Illinois Conference.
Again, properly before us. It beats reading off all the names. Any question? All those in favor say yes. Yes. And opposed, no. And it carries.
Bishop, I move that the standing rules as printed in the 2017 Northern Illinois Conference Journal be the standing rules for this session of the annual conference.
All right, it's properly before you. Any question? All those in favor say yes. Yes. And opposed, no. And it carries.
All right, this is a long one. Bishop, I move that members of the Conference Council on Finance and Administration, the Conference Board of Trustees who are not already members of the annual conference, the conference staff, persons who are here in relationship to the documents before us, and all persons certified by the Credentials Committee who are not otherwise voting members be seated within the voting bar of the conference and be given the right of voice for this session of the annual conference.
All right, that's properly before you. Any question? All those in favor say yes. Yes. And opposed, no. And it carries.
Bishop, I move that the plenary floor for this session of annual conference be the tables that are numbered. From the north side of the room to the south wall of the room, and from the platform on which we presently are to the western wall of the room, excluding tables that are not numbered and are designated for guests and visitors.
All right, properly before you. Now you know where north and south is. And we have our own western wall. All right. All those in favor, please say yes. Yes. And opposed, no. And it carries.
So then, Bishop, I move that the plenary floor, as just defined, be the voting bar for our conference.
All right. Again, any question? All those in favor say yes. Yes. And opposed, no. And it carries.
Okay, Bishop, this concludes the organizing motions for this session. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, and now I'll call on Katie Voigt to do a few more of our items of business to get us started, including the consent calendar.
Good morning, Bishop. Good morning, Annual Conference. My name is Katie Voigt. I am clergy from the Rockford District, serving at Pecatonica for a few more weeks, and then I'll be moving to Erie in the DeKalb District, and I am honored to be here as your chair of daily proceedings. In our time together this morning, we're going to start with the consent calendar that was available online early in May. A consent calendar helps us to proceed with our work more quickly and efficiently because one vote will be for all the items on the consent calendar. According to the standing rules you see printed on the preliminary consent calendar, your consent calendar committee met and put together the consent calendar that you found online. There are two categories for the consent calendar, one for approval and one for non-approval. We continue to want to stay clear about why the committee made the decisions we did. So again this year you found reasons that items were placed into the different categories of the consent calendar. We hope this was helpful and works toward the goal of helping all of us understand the work we do. The form to remove something from the consent calendar was available online at the same time that the consent calendar was, and was due yesterday at 3 p.m. I received paperwork to remove one item from the consent calendar. The 25 signatures must come from clergy or lay members of the annual conference. not just members of any local church. So I checked the names on the petition forms against our annual conference registration list. A word about the petition forms, please. If you ever sign a petition form to remove something from the consent calendar, on the line that says printed name, please print legibly so I can check your name against the list. And where it says church name and city, please write out the name of your church. UMC is not exactly helpful because I don't know if that's Pecatonica or Plano or Plainfield or any one of a number of other places. Also, as you might imagine, First UMC needs a city. Help me help you. I did have to rule one name as invalid because I couldn't read enough information on any of the lines to search the registration list. And I had to rule two names as invalid because they were not on the registration list for annual conference. The one petition I received did eventually meet all of the requirements. So document 70202, incorporation of ACST and DST into the standing rules of the annual conference, has been properly removed from the consent calendar per all of our requirements, so that will be added to the list to be dealt with individually. So now, properly before us is the preliminary consent calendar with 4 items for approval and 0 items for non-approval. Bishop, I move adoption of the consent calendar.
Okay, I think you heard the requirements for the consent calendar and how to remove them, and that one has been officially removed. So these other 4 are properly before you as part of our consent calendar. Any question? All right, then all those in favor of approving, and what you're doing is approving these legislative items on the consent calendar, please say yes. Yes. And if not, say no. And it carries.
I have 2 items to place before your consideration as at-conference documents. It's been a few years since we've dealt with an at-conference document, and so the way this works is that I will give you a little bit of information, the title and a little bit of basic information about the document, and then it will be our job as an annual conference to decide whether or not we're going to choose to receive this document. So, Bishop, the first one is titled Support of Constitutional Changes and was authored by Reverend Lisa Telemann. This document has to do with the 2 constitutional amendments that failed to pass in last year's voting. So, Bishop, it's ours to decide.
All right, and these are constitutional amendments that the whole church voted on, and 2 of them failed. And one of those we will later vote on because there were other irregularities with it. So it's just a statement. Any question? All those in favor of allowing this legislation to come before this session of the annual conference, please say yes. Yes. And opposed, say no. And it carries.
So this document will be ours to deal with then, and it will be numbered 700.03. So when you receive this document on your tables, you can just fill in the 03 on the support of constitutional changes. The second at-conference document is titled Affirmation of Theological Diversity and the One Church Model, authored by Pastor Edward Eddy, Lonnie Chafin, Reverend Lisa Cruz Safford, and Reverend Chris Winkler. So this piece of legislation has to do with the Commission on the Way Forward and the recommendation from the bishops.
All right. So again, will you receive this document for this session of the annual conference to review, discuss, and act upon? If so, will you say yes? If not, say no, and it is approved.
So then when you receive this document on your tables, it will be numbered 700.04. So now we turn to our historical reports. They were available online as during the first week of May as well as a separate download from the legislation. Bishop, I move acceptance of the historical reports as they were presented in the download.
All right, I'm sure you have all read them and commended them to mind. And I could ask any one of you any question about any of them. But you do have them, and they are properly before you to receive. Any question? All those in favor of receiving them, please say yes. And opposed, say no. And they are part of our historical record.
Thank you, Bishop.
Thank you. All right, then the agenda calls for the BBC report, and that will be by Reverend Adonna Reed. This is not the British Broadcasting Company, in case you were trying to get your news early this morning, but is the beloved community, building beloved community. I knew it was beloved. Welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, Bishop.
Good morning.
Good morning, Northern Illinois Annual Conference.
Good morning.
Let's try that again. Good morning. Good morning. Again, I am Adonna Davis Reed. I proudly serve South Shore United Methodist Church on the southeast side of Chicago. But today I stand before you as chair of the Building Beloved Community Committee, or Becoming Beloved Community, however you like, because that's what we are about doing. We are members of the Commission on Religion and Race, charged with the task of offering the annual conference gathering a checkup of sorts of our progress as an annual conference towards the goal of building beloved community, where all of God's children experience abundance of life regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, or any other designation that our society tends to separate people by. So how do you think things are going in your community, in your church? We all know that the scourge of racism and injustice is alive and all too well. In our everyday hearing of news, we see that even in the 50 years since Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination and the founding of our beloved church and the establishment of the Commission on Religion and Race, we still hear such vitriolic rhetoric that condemns people to places of subservience in our society. It seems sometimes that the problems are intractable and efforts at sustained change are often thwarted. But we are messengers of the good news of Jesus Christ. Amen? Amen. And so we do bring good news.
One of the exciting things that's happened in our conference this year has been the development of the awarding of a G-Corps grant in the amount of $30,000 to Urban Village Church, which will allow them to implement action steps that they identified in an anti-racism audit. That was conducted by Crossroads, an outside organization, and if you are interested in hearing more about how that anti-racism audit worked, Chris Coons, would you stand up and wave, please? Chris would be happy to talk with you about that. Several others of the staff of Urban Village Church were involved, and that was an effort on their part to intensively become an anti-racist faith community. We applaud that.
Amen. Amen. We've also learned that churches like Hartzell Memorial on Chicago's southeast side and a cluster of churches in the near western suburbs are engaging in conversation among themselves and with their communities. These courageous conversations are meant to foster greater understanding of ways we can advocate for and collaboratively work for equity and justice with and among the places we serve. But we don't believe the churches and the initiatives that we have lifted this morning is all that's going on in our annual conference.
10 years ago, the Commission on Religion and Race was the agency that did a monitoring report. You may remember we ensured that all voices were heard, and our committee has evolved into many other things, including we've served on 2 task forces, we've been a part of disseminating information, we've had listening sessions, and now what used to be a small group of people doing monitoring reports at annual conference has become the work of the conference in building beloved community. So we would like to see, so that we can all see the impact of what we are all trying to do, the shared ministry, and ask that every church that has been involved in conversations to build beloved community, and every one of you who have been involved on some kind of conference basis, whether that was on cross-cultural appointments or reducing racism, any of those justice efforts, would you please stand? Now, if you looked around, you have some idea on who to talk to if you want to continue this work. We want to thank you.
And the work continues. Thank you very much, Bishop.
Thank you. And now I'll turn to Nancy Pendergrass for our nominations.
Good morning, Annual Conference. I am Nancy Pendergrass. I'm a layperson from First United Methodist Church in Evanston, and I'm here on behalf of a wonderful group of people that have worked this year on the nominating committee. We've prepared 2 documents for you this year. For those of you who have been here in the past, there's document 100. It was placed online about 10 days ago. It's a multi-page report of all the different areas in which people serve at the conference level. What we have also prepared this year is a second very short document, 1 page, that highlights the people that are going to be elected for their positions for the very first time this year. So, as you look through this to know who you will be voting on tomorrow, it's the short list. Everybody else will be continuing their service from a prior year. If you are interested in participating at the conference level throughout the year, or have someone in your church whose gifts you think would be well used by the conference, there is an online form that they can fill out, or you can come and give me information. I'm at table 29, and the committee will be meeting in June to add those people for the coming year. So we aren't going to be adding and giving you a new list tomorrow. We're just going to be putting these people forward for election, and then the committee will be adding when they meet in June after annual conference. So thank you very much, and please think of all those wonderful people in your churches that can help us out.
Got to get all my technology going here. There we go. Suffering produces endurance. Endurance produces character. And character produces hope. And hope does not disappoint us, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. Hope does not disappoint us. How many of you have ever been whitewater rafting? Oh, I'd say for northern Illinois that has no, hills, I am really impressed. It's a thrilling experience, to say the least. At one of my churches in East Ohio, we had an annual whitewater rafting trip to the Youghiogheny River in Ohiopyle, Pennsylvania. And there are a couple of key principles to a successful rafting experience. Now, successful means you live to tell about it. One is that it's a lot quicker and less treacherous if the river is full and therefore flowing fast over all the large rocks. When it's low, there are more protruding rocks to get around or over. Which leads me to my next principle. Always lean into the rocks. Now, this is counterintuitive. Nobody wants to lean into a rock. But if you don't, what happens is in these hydraulics where the water is swirling around and your boat gets in there, it's sort of like a toilet drain, that you will go over and tip and you might fall out, or your boat might tip over totally. If you do get thrown out of the boat, and this has happened to me, you want to make sure there's somebody in that boat who's strong enough to reach over there and just pluck you out and throw you back down on the floor of the boat. And then finally, you need to listen carefully to the instructions given to you as you approach one of these fast-moving hydraulics so that you can remember to lean into the rock, not get thrown out of the boat, and therefore won't need someone to pluck you out. It's really quite simple, until you actually get right into it. Well, it seems like in many ways in our culture, but certainly in our church, we're trying to ride the rocky rapids of reality. The waters of hope seem low, and the obstacles seem to loom large. Leaning into them is intimidating. And as a result, it seems like we are on this rubber raft of a church, swirling around in this hydraulic which is caused by pressure in too small of a space. And we worry that our church will upset or will be thrown out, wondering if anyone will be there to help us ride successfully through the rocky rapids of our time. In almost every aspect of our lives these days, we find ourselves navigating uncharted waters. Things that worked in the past won't necessarily work today. There's frustration at not having the answers or the solutions. And even more frustration that pastors and leaders don't have the answers to the solutions. There's grief at the losses we experience in our communities and churches. And the fear itself can sometimes overwhelm us. What makes this such a rough ride? We no longer live in a convergent culture. A convergent situation is one where the questions are the same for everyone, and so are the answers. Everybody has the same answer to the same questions, so much so that we hardly ever even ask the questions, we assume them. So for instance, in a convergent culture, people don't really need to ask the question, who is that person? What's their name? Because in a convergent culture, everybody knows everybody. Or what does our family do on Sunday morning? In a convergent culture, the answer throughout the community might be, we go to church. Or, what are the normal stages of adult life? First comes love, then comes marriage, then you live together, and then comes you in the baby carriage. How's that working for you? Again, the questions or concerns are the same, and so much so that they are just assumed and rarely expressed out loud. There are still little pockets of convergent culture, but they're rare. But we don't live in a convergent culture overall. We live in a divergent culture, where we may, in fact, all have the same questions or all have the same concerns, but let me tell you, everybody has a different answer or solution to them. Have you noticed this even in your church? You could take a survey, and it would be divided up almost equally to all the different possible answers whatsoever. For instance, we're all concerned about stopping gun violence. Same concern, but the answers to solutions are very divergent. Or we're all concerned about the declining number of people in our churches, but we don't have one answer or solution as to what will help. Or pretty much everyone is weary of the impasse on human sexuality in the United Methodist Church. I asked the clergy at our session a couple weeks ago, how many of you are weary of this impasse? And I'm pretty sure that was one thing we all held in common. We're weary of it. The question, or the condition is the same, but there are many answers or solutions to getting by and past where we are. What we've learned about our impasse on human sexuality is that we hold divergent values or positions that lead us to our understanding of what the solution should be. So some, it may be a position on scriptural understanding. Others, it's a matter of social justice. Others yet, it's, frankly, their identity as LGBTQ persons, or of course, someone that they love. Or it may be a pastoral conviction that makes people feel that some or all of the services of the church or the denomination should be offered to all people or withheld from some people in their community. There are probably more divergent positions than this, and some of us hold a variety of these that I've just listed. But each of these positions is deeply grounded in our own system of beliefs and values. So trying to change each other's minds, much less each other's hearts, hasn't really moved us much. It's just made us mad at each other. Convergence works towards uniformity, everybody having the same answer or solution. Divergence recognizes that we are not ever going to have the same answer or solution. And so we seek unity based on something greater than agreement. So if unity isn't based on agreement or uniformity, what is it based on? Our unity is based on Jesus Christ and Christ's mission for us. It has never been clearer to me. There is no unity but this unity. And learning how to live with that kind of unity instead of continuing to do harm to one another on agreement or uniformity is probably the biggest uncharted territory that we face. But I would suggest it's a skill we need to learn. And our church can teach us. Because it's a skill that we all need, even in our own families, in our churches, in our communities, in our world. How do we live with people we don't agree with? Once when I was whitewater rafting, there was a young woman who was a friend of someone, so I didn't really know her. And I ended up sitting next to her in the boat. The guide would give these graphic instructions about what to do. I mean, you know, this was just his best time of the day, telling you all the things that were going to happen, that you were going to smash up against the rock when you got into the hydraulic, and you were going to swirl around if you didn't lean into it, and you were probably going to die. Well, he may not have told us that we were going to die, but I think that's pretty much how this young woman heard it. Because after a couple of these descriptions, I realized she was actually crying because she was so afraid. I feel like that's where the church is right now. There are rumors and rumors of rumors. And people who can be pretty catastrophic and causing a lot of anxiety when we need to just pay attention to the ride and go through with a clear understanding of what it means to be the church of Jesus Christ. This is not the worst thing that's ever happened to the church. And we will get through. So pay attention to the ride and hang on to each other. So part of this, I want to tell you about the three plans. Some of you at clergy session heard some of it or most of it. Some of you probably haven't heard anything. Some of you may have been reading and know some of it. So let me just quickly go through and describe it, because I personally think that the more information we have, the better it is. So let me go to the timeline. You know that about 2 years ago at General Conference, there came this impasse on the floor. And the Council of Bishops was asked to pause for prayer and to form a commission to explore options to maintain and strengthen the unity of the church. So they recruited a commission on the way forward to begin their work. It was a group of about 32 people, I think, and they met for the last 18 months. They started in 2017, and they've continued into 2018, meeting just a couple weeks ago. They've given 2 feedback sessions with the Council of Bishops. One of the things I always think gets overlooked in this whole commission on the way forward is that they had clear directives for mission, vision, and scope of their work. So while I admit that I pluck out a couple of sentences from each of these, I also think it helps to give a sense of the spirit in which they were to do their work. In the mission, it says that matters of human sexuality and unity are the presenting issues for a deeper conversation that surfaces different ways of interpreting Scripture and theological tradition. Divergence. We don't all interpret the Scripture the same. From the vision of the commission, they were called to design a way for being church that maximizes the presence of the United Methodist witness in as many places in the world as possible, and that allows for as much contextual differentiation as possible, and that balances an approach to different theological understandings of human sexuality with a desire for us for as much unity as possible. That's balancing a lot of things. This unity will not be grounded in our conceptions of human sexuality. I think that's a key sentence. But our affirmation on the triune God who calls us to be grace-filled and holy people in the Wesleyan tradition. So the scope of their work was to explore new ways of embodying unity that move us beyond where we are in the impasse, and to explore new ways of being in relationship across the cultures of Africa, Europe, the Philippines, the United States. And you may have even noticed that within the United States we have a great deal of divergence. It was to consider new forms and structures of being in relationship with each other as United Methodists in order to give greater freedom and flexibility to the future church. So they finished with this sentence, which I think is important. If we ignore this work, fracturing will occur in more haphazard and even self-interested ways. If we do this work only to address our preferences and self-interest, in other words, my way or the highway, we will fail to place our complete trust in God's steadfast love and faithfulness. Trust that God remains God. God is with us. God will never let us go. To God be the glory. Council of Bishops, as you may be aware, met here in the Chicagoland area at the end of April into May, and we heard and studied and discerned the Commission on the Way Forward's report and made a recommendation to the specially called General Conference in February of 2019. And we recommended the One Church Plan, or as I sometimes call it, the Big Tent. Now, what you also know is the Judicial Council met here in the Chicagoland area, May 22nd to the 25th, and they determined that there can be petitions sent to the General Conference in 2019 if they are in harmony with the call. I think it's fascinating that everybody has declared victory on that one for very different reasons. There are certain bars that they have to meet in order to be in harmony with the call of the General Conference. A full report will be released no later than July 8th. And this has created a great deal of frustration in the United States because people are chomping on the bit to be able to actually read the full report, which includes legislation, and to be able to begin to understand it and discuss it. But it allows for this report to be translated in all of the official languages of the United Methodist Church. For instance, do you know about 20% of our members are French-speaking? I should have kept up that French all those years. What a waste. It includes description of all models and the Council of Bishops' discernment of each, but it clearly recommends the one model of the One Church Plan. So what is the One Church Plan? It's based on these cultural contexts because we understand, we've observed that vital churches need room to thrive depending on what their missional context is, whether it's in the Congo or DeKalb or the east side of Chicago, southeast side of Chicago. They need to be able to respond to their context. So it removes the restrictive, the prohibitive language about homosexuality from the discipline. But it doesn't ensure acceptance of LGBTQ persons across the whole church. It provides a generous unity that gives conferences, churches, and clergy flexibility. And it does uphold unity of mission without uniformity of practice. It minimizes the voting that any local church would need to have. This was something that everybody heard. You know, don't make us all vote on which direction we go. So clergy will independently decide if they want to do same-gender weddings or not. Local churches will establish wedding policies or not. And that could end the threat or division and expense of complaints and church trials. And no annual conference, bishop, congregation, or clergy is compelled to act contrary to their convictions. There are protections provided for all. This is especially important to the central conferences who feel like the vestiges of colonialism has caused them to have to do things that they don't want to do, or they fear that more than anything. And given how good we are with constitutional amendments, this one provides no constitutional amendment. Now, each jurisdiction would provide the full support for all of the bishops in that jurisdiction and their offices. This is so that if there's, let's say, an LGBTQ person who is a bishop in another jurisdiction, you know that your money won't support that person. It doesn't change any of the restrictions about the use of apportionment funds. Each Board of Ordained Ministry, in discernment with bishop and cabinet, can or not recommend LGBTQ persons for ministry. That's a decision that will be made at the Board of Ordained Ministry level. There are few financial or pension implications unless significant numbers of churches or clergy leave a particular annual conference. And there is, even today, part of the discipline that allows for local churches to leave an annual conference. So if your annual conference, let's say, decides not to ordain LGBTQ persons, you could request as a church or clergy to become a member of another annual conference. You can see this could become a little confusing, but it's a possibility. People aren't forced to do what they don't want to do. Now, there's another plan that retains the present language of the Board of Ordained, I always say that, the Book of Discipline on Homosexuality, and adds significant and mandatory accountability processes. It mandates that any just resolution, for instance, of a clergy performing a same-gender wedding agrees not to do it again. That's mandated. And it requires every annual conference to certify that they will uphold, enforce, and maintain the Book of Discipline standards on LGBTQ ministry and marriage, which are no same-gender marriages, no LGBTQ clergy. You have to certify. I don't know what certified means, but annual conferences, local churches, and clergy that don't certify or agree to the Book of Discipline would be encouraged to leave, meaning they would receive no more support from GCF&A, and that they could join an autonomous, affiliated, or concordat church. Have any of you ever heard of an autonomous, affiliated, or concordat church? They exist, but there aren't presently any of those for annual conferences to join. So they would have to be developed within the next year or two after the General Conference, if the traditionalist model goes through. And you would no longer be a United Methodist or a United Methodist Church. Now, I'll tell you, there is very little support for this plan at the Council of Bishops, but there are several bishops and some other groups promoting it strongly. There's the Connectional Conference Plan, earlier known as the Three-Branch Plan, and it's gotten so little support that I only have one slide on it. It requires fully 28 constitutional amendments. They say they boiled it down to 8, but I still think ultimately it's just how they've grouped them. It has serious implications for pension. So every church, what would happen is every church and clergy would decide which branch they're in. Are they in the traditionalist branch, the unity branch, or the one church plan branch, or a progressive branch? And they would all have different pension implications for the whole church. When 3 or 4 conferences merged to become one annual conference, the Upper New York, it took several years to iron out all of the pension issues. So you can see that once Westpath began to talk about this, once we realized how good we are at constitutional amendments, I am finding very little support for this, but it's still a part of the full report, not the recommendation. So, after July 8th, the delegations will begin to meet to study and discuss the report and recommendation this summer and fall, and we will have more conversations about this. You'll be able to access all of this legislation and all of the report. And so on October 6th in the morning, there'll be a conversation in Rockford, in the afternoon in DeKalb. On October 20th, the Chicago Southern District will meet in the morning. In the afternoon, the Chicago Northwestern District. And November 10th, Elgin will meet in the morning and Aurora in the afternoon. And of course, you can go to whatever one you want. And then February 23rd to the 26th, there'll be a special session of the General Conference to act on this impasse in our church. So you say, what unites us? You can see there's a lot of divergent solutions, very divergent. You're one body and one spirit. Just as God has called you in one hope, there is one Lord, one faith, one baptism, and one God and Father of all, who is over all, through all, and in all. We are united in Christ Jesus. But maybe even more importantly, how then shall we live? I encourage you to live as people worthy of the call you received from God. Conduct yourselves with all humility, gentleness, and patience. Accept each other with love and make an effort to preserve the unity of the Spirit with the peace that binds you together. So there is a quiz. Well, not so much a quiz. But I want you to have some table talk. And I have 3 questions. And I'm going to give you about 5 minutes for each of the questions. I hope that you'll continue them even beyond now. But the first one is I want you to think a little bit about this convergence and divergence thing. And so how have you experienced a shift from convergence, everybody has the same question and the concern, and everybody has the same answer, or to divergence in your church? It could be your local church. It could be this annual conference. It could be our denomination. How have you seen the shift over the years from convergence to divergence? Give an example. It can be even a very small one, but it helps you to recognize that shift. And most importantly, how does it make you feel? How does it make you feel to live in a divergent world? Now, I want you to divide up no more than 3. Sometimes United Methodists have trouble counting. So, all of a sudden you'll see no more than 3, and there's 7 people. You're not going to have time to talk with 7 people. So 2 or 3 people, how have you experienced a shift from convergence to divergence in the church? And how does it make you feel? 5 minutes. Go.